There's but one serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide, wrote the French philosopher Albert Camus. Is suicide an appropriate answer to the fact that life appears meaningless for the rational thinking individual, and thus, in the midst of suffering, simply not worth living? After all, he surmised, we live life with the belief that we're very meaningful and profound, only to discover that the universe wasn't made for us and will continue to exist long after the last human has ushered in his last breath. His answer to the question, no, it requires revolt, and he detailed why in his philosophical essay, The Myth of Sisyphus. This video will serve as one interpretation of this essay, and I'll give my thoughts on how relevant the ideas are in it at the end of the video. Now, written in October of 1942, this work is divided into four main sections. Number one, an absurd reasoning. Number two, the absurd man. Number three, absurd creation. And number four, the myth of Sisyphus, and then finally an appendix that reflects on the work of Franz Kafka, the Bohemian novelist. First, an absurd reasoning. In the opening pages, Camus describes the main problem with human existence that leads one to feel life is not worth living, a philosophical idea he calls the absurd. Man stands face to face with the irrational. He feels within him his longing for happiness and for reason. The absurd is born of this confrontation between the human need and the unreasonable silence of the world. See, it's only natural for humans to seek out meaning in life. However, a conflict occurs when we go to do so and find the universe is really cold, chaotic, and utterly devoid of any meaning. It's not that we're irrational or the universe is irrational, it's simply this contradiction between our mind's search for meaning and the reality of nature we can call the absurd. Now, he doesn't mean absurd as in the world is impossible to understand or comprehend. Thanks to science, we have fascinating descriptions of how the world works. However, true knowledge and rationality are impossible, as they cannot explain the world or give meaning to it. Science and metaphysics can only give descriptions or stories that end in meaningless abstractions. Just think of the description that humans are made of electrons. What knowledge does this honestly give us? He writes, "At the final stage, you teach me that this wonderful and multicolored universe can be reduced to the atom, and that the atom itself can be reduced to the electron. All this is good, and I wait for you to continue. But you tell me of an invisible planetary system in which electrons gravitate around a nucleus. You explain this world to me with an image. I realize then that you have been reduced to poetry. I shall never know." Camus notes that previous philosophers, including Martin Heidegger, Karl Jaspers, Soren Kierkegaard, and others, have all confronted the absurd and attempted to reconcile it. The problem is that all their conclusions end in what he calls philosophical suicide, or in a logical conclusion to absurdity that there is an objective meaning to life that arises from absurd positioning itself. For instance, take Kierkegaard. When confronted with the absurd, Kierkegaard asks us to suspend all rational and moral beliefs and take the leap of faith to God. Kierkegaard is asking us to essentially pretend in make-believe is truth and accept a limited role of freedom in our lives with the imposed moral codes that follow. So we should rule out philosophical suicide as an answer to this question. Also, he writes that we should rule out actual suicide as a reasonable answer to the absurd, as life is sort of a miracle to begin with, and the absurd cannot exist without man. That leaves us with option 3, embrace the absurd, which he believed was the correct solution. When one chooses to embrace the absurd, 3 consequences happen: revolt, freedom, and passion. When we embrace the absurd, we realize that we're truly free to do what we want, and one should seize what life has to offer. How exactly does one do that, though? Well, that brings us to chapter 2, the absurd man. How does one embrace the absurd and live? To begin, he writes, "For the absurd man, it's not a matter of explaining and solving, but of experiencing and describing. Everything begins with lucid indifference." Camus notes that this indifference includes morality and ethics, as ethics denotes a higher power or authority that now we know isn't real. Camus gives us 3 sketches, not to be taken as literal descriptions, on how the absurd man should live one's life. Don Juan, the actor, and the conqueror. First, we have Don Juan, the famous serial seducer of women. Simply look at the paintings and stories of Don Juan, Camus writes. Does this seem like a man that's miserable and unhappy a lot of the time? Don Juan sacrifices any promise of eternal life or fake nobility for a life of passion and excitement each day. A constant smile on his face, Don Juan recognizes that there is no noble love but that which recognizes itself to be both short-lived and exceptional. Next, Camus gives us the actor, the epitome of the absurd man, he writes. Why? Because a great and talented actor fully invests himself into the character he's acting out on the stage only for 2 to 3 hours. In it, he loses his own identity to live the life of someone else entirely, knowing that the job will end and the character to die just hours from now, over and over. In those 3 hours, he travels the whole course of the dead-end path that the man in the audience takes a lifetime to cover, he writes. And finally, we have the conqueror. Conqueror does not mean a man who goes into battle for some noble truth or to become a king, but simply for the love of battle. Think of an entrepreneur of today, perhaps, that loves the hustle and grind of building businesses. He lives for the climb to the top more than the fancy car, title, or paycheck he'll get there. And next we have part 3, absurd creation. Now here Camus reflects on art, specifically fiction writing, and how it helps describe absurd living. He points out that art reflects different aspects of our lives, but it cannot add anything to it. Again, this embodies the absurd man, as we can't hope to explain life or find true knowledge. The absurd man does not hope to explain life, only to describe it. Art in all forms reflects different aspects of or perspectives on life, but cannot add anything to it. There's no meaning or transcendence to be found in art, as in life itself. However, the creative act of asserting one's own perspective on the world epitomizes the revolt, passion, and freedom of the absurd man. If the world were clear, art would not exist. Absurd art, especially fiction writing, should avoid explaining life or offer some hope or philosophical suicide, he writes. An author that captured this, but fell a little bit short in the end, was Dostoevsky, he thinks. He gives the example of Kirillov from his work The Possessed. Kirillov commits suicide in revolt against the idea that God does not exist, a creative act to become God, Camus surmises. Kirillov makes the wrong decision, but Camus uses this example to portray how Dostoevsky understood the absurd through his characters and writings. Chapter 4 is the Myth of Sisyphus, where Camus gives us our absurd hero, Sisyphus, from Greek mythology. Sisyphus was a man who hated death and put death in chains so that no mortal may die again. The gods were not too happy with this. Death was eventually liberated, and when it came time for Sisyphus to die, the gods condemned him to a creative eternal punishment. Sisyphus was to roll a boulder up a mountain only for it to fall back again, and for him to roll up again over and over again, a meaningless but unavoidable task. Camus says our lives are a lot like that of Sisyphus. We all fear and hate death, and most of us spend a good portion of our lives working meaningless jobs in offices and factories just to survive. We're all rolling meaningless boulders up hills, as life will have many unavoidable hardships. What's the solution to Camus' initial question of suicide then? He writes that we need to be fully conscious of our situation and stop trying to fix it by avoiding false solutions such as religion, refusing to submit, and living life with intensity and vitality. We need to imagine Sisyphus happy, he writes, embracing the struggle with our condition head on and living life to the fullest we can. Stop trying to deny that life isn't hard and meaningless, and instead rebel, seizing the moment and sucking the proverbial marrow out of life. I leave Sisyphus at the foot of the mountain. One always finds one's burden again, but Sisyphus teaches the higher fidelity that negates the gods and raises rocks. He too concludes that all is well. This universe henceforth without a master seems to him neither sterile nor futile. Each atom of that stone, each mineral flake of that night-filled mountain, in itself forms a world. The struggle itself toward the heights is enough to fill a man's heart. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. Okay, so that in a nutshell is the Myth of Sisyphus. Of course, there's far more to it, so feel free to read it yourself. It's not a long read. So are the ideas here relevant today and correct? Well, here are just a few thoughts that I had after reading it. First, like many other existential philosophers, Camus seems not interested in taking epistemology, metaphysics, and science too seriously. In fact, he says something along the lines of, it doesn't matter whether the Earth travels around the sun or the sun around the Earth. Now, of course, today we know that it matters a lot, since science is helping lift people out of depression and darkness every day with things like treatments for childhood cancer or medications for mental disorders. Science and metaphysics are far more than mere descriptive elements of reality and important to the human condition and happiness. It seems like Camus is almost like the philosophers he ran over at the start, like Kierkegaard. It seems he arrived at his conclusions to life at the start. In this case, life is fully meaningless no matter what, and then began working backward on how he might arrive there and then what to do. However, there are many good ideas in this essay that you can take into your own life, like not embracing illogical conclusions just to feel comfortable, and not being afraid to confront the realities of life and the human condition. Plus, one could think of his work as a much-needed response to this idea that we ought to constantly strive to be some great individual that we think we ought to become or others want us to be in life. Life's not about some destination. Yes, life is hard, but why not say screw it and pick stuff we love doing and do it, living in the moment and embracing life? So let me know what your thoughts are on the myth of Sisyphus and anything mentioned here. Did Camus get it right, essentially, about life? Or is this more like a work of fiction and we can just pull parts here and there out if we want to? And if you want more videos like this, again, make sure to subscribe for more videos, like it below using the link in the description, and turn on the notification bell to receive updates when the videos come out. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you again.